You're here just in time. Today, the top 20 of all the fantasy fiction books I've read, all the way up here through 2024. How many of them will be your favorites as well? Welcome to Fantasy for the Ages. I'm Jim, the father of this father son show where we talk about fantasy, science fiction, horror, other nerdy things we enjoy. Today, just me here, the father, bringing you my top 20 list. Now, this is the last part of my top 100 fantasy fiction books that I've read through 2024. I encourage you to go back and check out those other episodes. So many great books that I hope you've also enjoyed. But if you haven't, they should go on your to be read lists, your TBR. But today, the final, the best, my top 20, which I'll start at 20 and go all the way up to number 1. I hope you'll enjoy this and hit that like button and subscribe to our channel if you haven't done so. We just enjoy bringing you more and more content to entertain and to give you other things to fall in love with, just like we have. Books, movies, TV shows, whatever. Well, let's do the list, huh? Number 20, we start with Magician's Apprentice, book 1 of the Rift War cycle and saga by Raymond E. Feist. This came out in 1982, so it's back a ways. It's high fantasy fiction. This book introduces the world of Midkemia to us, and the young protagonist, Pug. It's known for its mix of classic fantasy tropes and innovative interdimensional warfare. That was something fresh and new. Now, this book was originally published as the book Magician, where this was just the first half of the book. Magician Master, then, is the second half. So they published it as one book in the United Kingdom. Here in the United States, they did it in 2 halves. You can still find it in some places, and thanks to the internet, it's fairly easy, as just one book, Magician. Number 19, Magician Master, book 2 of the Rift War saga, or just the second half of the first book, also by Raymond D. Feist, and also published in 1982, because duh, one book. The genre is still high fantasy. This continues the saga of Pug as he rises to power as a master magician. It builds upon that interdimensional conflict that was introduced in the first book between Midkemia and Kelawon. Feist has noted that breaking the one book, Magician, into 2 smaller novels actually was not a bad idea. He thought it worked quite well. There's kind of a natural breaking point in the narrative. So if you'd never known that once upon a time it was just one book, it makes perfect sense that it's 2. Number 18, The Heroes, book 5 in Joe Abercrombie's First Law world. This was published in 2011 and, of course, is grimdark fantasy. This is a standalone novel centered on a single brutal battle that lasts for 3 days. This book is known for its nuanced characters and exploration of the futility of war. The story is heavily inspired by the author's fascination with historical battles, particularly the way they unfold over time and affect individuals on both sides of the equation. Number 17, a true classic, The Return of the King, the final volume of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, by, of course, J.R.R. Tolkien, the grandfather of all we have in modern fantasy. This was published in 1955 and is considered high fantasy. So this concludes the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the fall of Sauron, the restoration of Aragorn as the king. It's celebrated for its profound themes of sacrifice, hope, and renewal. Tolkien originally wanted the final 2 volumes of The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers and The Return of the King, to have different titles. He was not entirely satisfied with The Return of the King because he felt it kind of gave too much away. He wanted the conclusion to have a little more mystery. One of his proposed alternative titles for the volume was The War of the Ring. However, the publisher overruled him, believing The Return of the King would be more compelling and marketable, and, well, it kind of worked out. Number 16, Midnight Tides, Book 5 of Malazan, Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. This was published in 2004. Its genre is high fantasy. This is largely a standalone installment of Malazan focused on the Tisti Adur and the Letharai. It explores themes of greed, conquest, and tragic family dynamics. It came at a perfect part in the series for me. I really enjoyed this book and its different tone compared to the four before it. So, unlike previous books, it focuses on completely different characters and a totally different continent. We jumped around to other places and people in the first four books, but there was still an overall tie-in between them. And this one seemed to go, it was like, and now for something completely different. It does tie in, as you see when you continue the series, but it's one of my favorites. Number 15, Rhythm of War, Book 4 of the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson, published in 2020, from which we had to wait 4 years until we just got Book 5, Wind and Truth. This is epic fantasy. Rhythm of War explores Navani Kolin's scientific endeavors and the mysteries of Fabrials. It features intense character development and the escalating conflict between the Radiants and the Fused. Sanderson revealed that Rhythm of War was one of the most challenging books in the Stormlight Archive to write because of its intricate timeline and the complexity of its multiple characters' arcs. And whose fault is that, Brandon? Number 14, Knife of Dreams, The Wheel of Time, Book 11, written by Robert Jordan and published in 2005. The genre is epic fantasy. This book progresses multiple storylines, including the resolution of Perrin's hunt for Fail. It's considered a return to form with significant plot advancements before Sanderson then takes over with the next book, because this is the last book Jordan wrote completely on his own before he passed away. Number 13, Dragonflight. This is Book 1 of The Dragon Riders of Pern by Anne McCaffrey, published in 1968, a blend of science fiction and fantasy. It introduces the world of Pern and its symbiotic relationship between dragons and humans. It's notable as one of the first books to merge science fiction with fantasy elements. This story was actually published originally as 2 separate novellas, both very successful in magazines that were out there, and Anne McCaffrey took the 2, added a little to tie them together, and republished it as a novel that was very successful. Number 12 is Dragon Quest, the sequel. This is Book 2 of the Dragon Riders of Pern, and really completes a key element of the story started in Dragonflight. It was published by Anne McCaffrey in 1971 and is, again, science fiction and fantasy blended together. So we get the continuation of the fight against Threadfall, focusing on political intrigue and discovery of Pern's lost technology. There's some mystery to be unveiled. It also establishes the series' blend of fantasy aesthetics and sci-fi logic, which is not nearly as obvious in Book 1. This book was nominated for the Hugo Award for Best Novel in 1972, making it one of the early works of science fiction and fantasy to gain recognition in both genres. Well done, Anne McCaffrey. Number 11, Oathbringer, Book 3 of the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson, published in 2017. Again, the genre is epic fantasy. Really, Rhythm of War and Oathbringer are very close for me, but Oathbringer edges Rhythm of War out just a bit. This book explores Dalinar Kolin's backstory and his struggle with guilt and redemption. It features massive revelations about Roshar's history and the Voidbringers. This book gives us the meaning of the huge line for this series, "You cannot have my pain." If you know, you know. All right, let's get to the top 10, people. The 10 best books I've ever read in the fantasy genre. Number 10 is Toll the Hounds, the 8th book of Malazan, Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson, published in 2008. The genre is high fantasy. This is a contemplative, character-driven entry that revisits Darujhistan. It's noted for its poetic prose and explorations of themes like grief and redemption. The narrative has a unique structure with sections told from the perspective of a dead man. Number 9, All the Wares of Pern, Book 11 of The Dragon Riders of Pern by Anne McCaffrey. This was published in 1991. The genre, again, is science fiction and fantasy. This chronicles the rediscovery of ancient technology to end Threadfall forever. It's celebrated for merging Pern's fantasy elements with its sci-fi roots just beautifully. This is one of the first books in the Dragon Riders of Pern series to delve heavily into science fiction elements. I mean, we're not just sci-fi adjacent at all. We're in it. We have gone deep. McCaffrey often cited her desire to create a seamless blend of genres as one of the challenges and joys of writing this installment. Number 8, Cain's Law, the final book, Book 4 of The Acts of Cain by Matthew Stover. This was published in 2012 and is dark fantasy with sci-fi leanings. This book is an experimental, non-linear narrative that dives deep into Cain's psyche and legacy. It blends brutal action with philosophical reflections on storytelling and reality. This book is brilliant, and I'm shocked more people don't know about it. Stover has mentioned in interviews that his approach to writing Cain's Law was deeply influenced by his interest in existential philosophy and mythological storytelling. Don't let those heady terms scare you off. It did lead him to create a very unconventional narrative structure for this book, but it's just fascinating to read and so enjoyable. Number 7, The Stand by Stephen King. My favorite Stephen King book of all time. It was published in 1978 originally. And then in 1990, the unabridged full version came out. This is apocalyptic horror fantasy. This is about a battle between good and evil that unfolds after a pandemic wipes out most of humanity. It's known for its richly developed characters and the exploration of societal collapse and what does mankind do? Originally, this book was 150,000 words left on the cutting page floor. It's kind of like in 1978, Stephen King, not very successful yet, just a middling author who's got a few hot books out there now, brings this forward, and they're like, no, that book is way too long. And so he had to cut. And then, 12 years later, when Stephen King is selling like hotcakes, they're like, oh yes, Mr. King, absolutely. We will print that big hunkin' volume for you now. I've read both versions. I definitely love the longer one. That's the one I still have on a hard copy sitting on a bookshelf. Number 6 is a cheat. 2 books, and I'll explain. It's Peace Talks and Battleground, Dresden Files, books 16 and 17. These were published by Jim Butcher, both in the year 2020, just 6 months apart. They are urban fantasy, and they're all we have for core novels of the Dresden Files to date. More is to come. Peace Talks sets up a supernatural war with high stakes, while Battleground delivers an action-packed showdown. Together, they shift the Dresden Files to a darker, more epic scale. I can't wait for the next books that are coming. But these books were initially planned as one book. But they were split because they would have been far longer, like double the size of anything else that had come out in the Dresden Files. So 2 books, just not very far apart. He wrote the whole thing and then did them in sections. I read them both, one right after another, no waiting, because I started the Dresden Files just after Battleground was published. That was a good ride. Number 5, The Shadow Rising, Book 4 of The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. This was published in 1992. The genre is epic fantasy. This book delves into greater world building with Randall Thor's journey to the Aiel Waste. It features significant character developments and the uncovering of ancient mysteries. A unique nugget about The Shadow Rising is it is the longest single book in the Wheel of Time, all the way back at book 4 by word count. There's a lot of words. Number 4, The Bone Hunters. Book 6 of Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. This one was published in 2006 and is high fantasy. We continue the saga with the Bone Hunters' army's journey and political upheavals in 7 cities. It showcases some of the most intense battles and personal tragedies of the series. The Bone Hunters was one of the books where Erikson's archaeology background particularly influenced his writing. Well, that brings us to the final 3. Just something special about the top 3. And what's sitting at the top of the heap here? Well, number 3 is Reaper's Gale, book 7 of Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson, published in 2007. The genre is high fantasy. This one focuses on the Letharii Empire and explores themes of colonialism and resistance. It features the convergence of several key characters from across the series and factions coming together in a brutal, unpredictable climax. The UK and US editions have different cover styles, and looking at them, what you see reflected is regional preferences for what attracts fantasy readers. It's kind of interesting. This is actually true for most of the books of the series. What they show in the US, that's targeted to the US style, and the UK gets something different. I kind of lean in towards the UK versions. Number 2, The Crippled God. The final book, book 10 of Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson, published in 2011. The genre, again, is high fantasy. This is a sprawling finale to the Malazan saga as it ties together dozens of story arcs. This book is known for its epic battles, philosophical depth, and bittersweet conclusion. Steven Erikson wrote the final chapter of this book first, as it served as a keystone for the entire series. And that brings me to number 1. For the second year in a row, number 1 is still for me A Memory of Light. Book 14, the final book of the Wheel of Time, written by Brandon Sanderson, but based on Robert Jordan's notes, and segments of this story were written by Robert Jordan before he passed away. Publication date was 2013, the genre epic fantasy. So yes, this concludes the Wheel of Time. Sadly, there's more stories that could have been told, but this is where it ends. And it has the climactic last battle, which some people love, me, and some hate. That one chapter, the last battle, is longer than Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone as a novel. It's amazing. It is renowned for resolving intricate storylines that were built up over the entire 14-book series, and I found it very satisfying. The last chapter was written by Robert Jordan before his passing. Serves as a foundation for the series' conclusion as a whole. Whew. There you go, people. My top 20 and my entire 100 books for fantasy fiction are before you now. What do you think? What would you have done different? What do you love that's on the list? What do you disagree with? Comment box, that's what it's for. Let me know your thoughts and I will respond. And you want to interact in other ways? Look in the show notes. Our Discord server, there's an invite to come join us and many other people get in on the conversations. Our social media links are there. A Patreon, if you want to support us, you can become one of our Patreon supporters. All the information's there. We even have an email address. Check it out. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you next time.